So the research for this book came out of my interest in Theodore Roosevelt, and I had, for a long time, I lived for about 10 years in New York, and it was one of the first classes I ever taught when I was teaching at McGill was on Roosevelt. And so I was reading all of the biographies of Roosevelt that try to portray him as a man of the West, right? A cowboy, a hunter, a cattle rancher, when Roosevelt was born and raised in Manhattan, right, the most thoroughly urbanized part of the United States in the 19th century and still today in the United States. And before Donald Trump became president, Roosevelt was the only American president born in New York City. And he still remains the only American president born in Manhattan. That's kind of hard to believe, too, after 200 years that we've only had one American president ever born in Manhattan. And so I was researching Roosevelt's life and early political career in New York. And of course, one of the positions that he served was as police commissioner. If any of you have been watching the Tom Selleck TV show Blue Bloods, right, about a family of New York City policemen, and Tom Selleck is the commissioner. He's got a picture, a very big, prominent picture of Theodore Roosevelt always hanging in the background. So it's one good reason to watch Tom Selleck. I'm a Magnum PI fan myself, but that was many, many years ago. And, Commissioner Roosevelt had a number of initiatives while he was commissioner, but I came across a letter while he was commissioner that I wrote to his sister Anna, and it was very simple. It says, well, we've had two excitements in New York this past week. The heated term, he said, was the worst and most fatal we have ever known. The death rate trebled until it approached the ratio of a cholera epidemic. The horses died by the hundreds so that it was impossible to remove their carcasses, and they added a genuine flavor of pestilence. As well, he noted, it was Bryan's big meeting, and that is William Jennings Bryan, right, Democratic candidate for president, coming to New York City to give his big speech in Madison Square Garden. So that was the three things I thought were kind of an interesting convergence. Roosevelt, interesting always, on his own, a heat wave that I had never heard about before, and the politics of 1896, right, a presidential campaign. And William Jennings Bryan, who's this rural populist from Nebraska, visiting what he terms enemy's country. That's what he called New York City, right? To try to win over the masses, especially the working class, to a populist and to the Democratic ticket. The heat wave was 10 days of high temperatures and high humidity. And so we're talking about 90 degrees straight, no wind, no rain, and close to about 90% humidity. Observing all this, future president of the United States. And I mentioned William Jennings Bryan. So this is a heat index that could easily reach 120 and 130 degrees. Temperature inside the brick and stone tenements reaching 120 degrees. And so think about if you're working class, and that's mainly who was affected by this. In modern heat waves, the people who are always most warned about the effects of the extreme heat are the very young and the very old. And I'm a political historian, so I wasn't really looking to write a social history, but it surprised me as I was going through the death certificates that there really wasn't an increase in the rate among the young and the old. Who was affected? Working class immigrants living in tenements. So you work 7 days a week, 12 hours a day, doing manual labor, often outside in the heat, near a heat source, a furnace, a smelter, and then you go home to rest. Well, where are you resting? You're resting in a place, there's no air conditioning, there's no electronic refrigeration that reaches 120 degrees. the medical examiners, the coroner's office, when bodies would come into their office and they would have to do an exam and fill out a death certificate, some of the more enterprising coroners would take the body temperature at the time of death. And the body temperature at the time of death for some of the corpses coming in were 110 degrees, 111 degrees. So that's a core temperature at the time of death. No infection, no fever. That's how hot their bodies were, just baking their organs inside of them. I estimated that about 1,300 people died during the heat wave. Thousands of horses dead on the street, so much so that the contractor responsible for taking the horses away just simply could not keep up with the demand. And there's a story later on that Theodore Roosevelt tells about the effect of these horses sitting on the street during a heat wave, right? Baking on the hot asphalt day after day after day. And millions of commerce lost for New York City, which was a commercial hub, of course it was a financial hub, but it was still also the industrial hub of the United States as well. And lots of people did not visit New York City during the heat wave. This is one I refer to it as perhaps America's most forgotten natural disaster. And we tend to forget about heat waves as disasters. I'll talk more about it. In fact, more Americans die from heat waves every year on average than die from tornadoes or hurricanes or earthquakes combined. But what's the image that we associate with heat waves? I mean, there isn't. There's no property damage. There's no dramatic swirl on, the weatherman's radar. Usually when there's a heat warning, what do we see on the local news? Like children eating ice cream, playing in the fountain, right? A heat wave is not a disaster. It's a holiday, right? It's a time to be outside. No, heat waves are incredibly dangerous, right? Incredibly, murderous for even Americans still living in one of the most industrialized nations of the world. If you were watching the news this past week, just a couple days ago, Pakistan right now is having a heat wave. Think about these temperatures, these living conditions in Pakistan, in Mumbai, India, in Brazil, in the developing world. This is truly murderous conditions. This is one of the sources that I used during my research. And so this is one of thousands of death certificates that can be found in the municipal archives in New York City. And it's a great source. And so it's kind of hard to see. So this is the guy's name, John Singer. This is the cause of death. I don't know if you can read that. Heat stroke, yeah. But beyond that, down here, it gives a lot of great information that was kind of fun to pinpoint, who these people are. So they've got the age, 45. You have that he's white. You have that he was born in the United States. When actually, most of the victims were either immigrants or the children of immigrants. You have that his occupation is a silver molder, right? So talk about a hot occupation to have during a heat wave, right? Working with a heat source. It gives you the address of his residence. And what's fantastic is I don't have to go back to a map of 1896 and see what kind of building it was. It says right here, tenement, right? That this is where he lived. He lived in a tenement. Oftentimes it would say on the death certificate, rear tenement, right? Which means that it was at the back of the building, probably pressed up against another building, no air, right? No natural light to come in. So once again, we have the primary cause of death, heat stroke. What's the secondary cause of death? I don't know if you can read that. Summer heat, right? A good scientific, diagnosis of why a guy died. Why did he die? It was really hot outside. So this is how I got to the average heat wave victim, by going through these thousands of death certificates and really just doing very scientific thing of doing like a hash mark every time I came across a certain age, a certain occupation, a certain place they lived, and a certain sex. And absolutely, overwhelmingly, and I think I have figures later on that break this down more, the average victim was very clearly male, not female, right? A laborer outside working, an immigrant or the son of immigrants living in a tenement. And it's particularly hit the Lower East Side, where, of course, if you visit New York City, maybe you even visit the Lower East Side Tenement Museum, which is a fantastic museum. And even that museum, when you go inside and you see kind of a typical tenement, even that's pretty luxurious for what they had in the 19th century, with several families often, living in the same room. How, if you're living in this, do you get fresh air? Well, often you would go to the fire escape, or you would go to, here's the total. So this is a breakdown of just one day. This is kind of the height of the heat wave, right? The number that were identified as heat-related deaths actually on death certificates was 217. Of the number of victims, almost all living in tenements, predominantly male, mostly laborers, and again, mostly in the middle range of age, not the very young and not the elderly as well. To escape the tenements, people went on fire escapes, and they went to their rooftops as well. And of course, people would try to sleep on the rooftops, and people would try to sleep on the docks on the river. And inevitably, what would happen when someone would fall asleep? You would roll off into the river and drown, or you would roll off the roof and die. So an excerpt from the book: one night during the heat wave, John Hughes could not sleep. Hughes made frequent trips to the local saloon, where he purchased large cans of beer called growlers, right? You in Vermont are well associated with growlers. Returning to the roof to drink, Hughes continued to the roof, and after drinking the beer, apparently lay down on the low parapet surrounding it. A woman whose window looked out on the roof called to Hughes that he would roll over and be killed. Hughes drunkenly replied that his death wouldn't cost the neighborhood much. A short time later, Hughes fell asleep on the parapet and indeed rolled off the roof. He fell 5 stories into the concrete paved courtyard of his building, where a police officer later found his crushed body covered by blood and by the clothing from all the wash lines that Hughes had broken during his fall, and his body was taken to the morgue. Poor John Hughes. We probably shouldn't be laughing, right? So John Hughes is forgotten, worker. The only way he's remembered in history over 100 years later is the kind of unfortunate means of his drunken death. So this is a cartoon from the time trying to sleep. There are also these waste bins that were placed around the city, kind of big bins like the dumpsters they have now with lids on them, and it would be very frequently people would be trying to sleep on top of these garbage bins, or sleeping like right on the curb of the street. Anything to be outside to get a whiff of fresh air. What's interesting is that at this time, Brooklyn is still a separate city, right? Consolidation between New York City and Brooklyn doesn't take place until a couple of years later. The mayor of Brooklyn suspended the law that forbids you from sleeping in the parks. And so in Brooklyn, just across the river, thousands of people descended onto the parks and slept there. The New York City mayor didn't do that, right? He kept that law in place. And so it remained a crime all through the killer heat wave to sleep in the park, a natural, including Central Park, a natural place to go if you're trying to get some relief from the heat. Again, another kind of hand-drawn etching of what it's like to try to get your, infant baby to sleep during 130-degree heat index weather. And then there were the dead horses. And so this is, Theodore Roosevelt's position as police commissioner also gave him a seat on the Board of Health. And so this is the city body responsible for taking away the dead horses. And in his autobiography, Roosevelt tells the story of a man who repeatedly complained of a dead horse in front of his shop, keeping the customers away with the smell day after day after day. This dead, rotting, gaseous horse right in front of the door to his shop. And so finally, the health department sent a cart to take the carcass away. And this was a giant vehicle that already had on it 11 other dead horses. And what happens when this cart with 11 dead horses gets in front of the man's shop to take the 12th horse away? It breaks down. And so now the man has in front of his shop 12 dead horses on a 90-degree day with 90% humidity. And so he sent a new request to the Board of Health that either please remove either the horses or his shop. He didn't care which. This is one of the kind of original ideas that came out of the heat wave. The New York City mayor at the time didn't even call an emergency meeting of his council, of his cabinet, which included Theodore Roosevelt, until the heat wave was almost over. So it was really up to kind of individual city department heads like Roosevelt and also like the Commissioner of Public Works. And so the Commissioner of Public Works came up with the idea of hosing down the streets on the Lower East Side, not only to get rid of all the kind of stinking detritus in the streets and horse urine, but to cool off, right, the steaming pavement. And it apparently had a tremendous effect. People talked about in the news, that you could feel almost the temperature dropping by several degrees as the hoses washed off the steaming asphalt streets. That's something that the Commissioner of the City of Public Works did. Roosevelt did a couple things. He had police wagons pressed into service as emergency ambulances. He never did let his police officers kind of break from wearing the heavy wool uniform of New York City policemen. And a number of New York City policemen died, as you would expect, walking their beat, responding to the hundreds and hundreds of calls about people collapsing in the heat. So police officers actually had, took a bit of a toll. The heat took a bit of a toll on the police officers. Another idea, though, that Roosevelt had, which was very unique, was giving away free ice in the tenements. And it's kind of hard still probably for us to get our minds around the fact that there wasn't electronic refrigeration, that you really had ice boxes lined with tin or zinc, and you would buy, big blocks of 10-pound blocks of ice from, the ice vendor who would, you'd have the big thing, the pincers, and then you have to bring it upstairs. And there's one story that a fist fight broke out because, the ice vendor was trying to make several deliveries a day, and somebody wanted help bringing the ice all the way up, to the top floor of their tenement. And during their argument, while it's 90 degrees outside, of course, what happens to the ice, right? It shrinks to about half its size, and the vendor wants the full price for the 10-pound block of ice, but the customer didn't want to pay for it. And we think about Roosevelt, and one thing we know about Roosevelt later when he's president is that he's a trust buster, right? He breaks up monopolies. He breaks up trusts that are stifling business, stifling competition, raising prices. And he actually does this with ice during the heat wave. There's actually an ice trust in New York City. A guy from Maine by the name of Charles Morse, of course he's always Maine, those guys are, crazy there, right? His own hometown newspaper called him the man who made millions while poor people suffered for ice, right? Morse came to New York City, bought up a number of independent ice companies and consolidated them into an ice trust and jacked up the price of ice, raising it out of reach of a lot of the poor families who were really, really depending on it. It's the only cold thing in their tenement. Certainly the only way to keep food or milk, if you have, a newborn baby, fresh in your 120-degree brick and stone tenement. So this is Roosevelt. He actually had the idea that the city would purchase ice and give it away to the poor areas using New York City police precincts. So he had hundreds of, not hundreds, but he had tons of ice delivered to the Lower East Side tenement precincts, and he personally supervised as the ice was handed out. So he had his beat cops go around with tickets. And so the beat cops knew the families, knew the people in need, knew the widows, knew the people who had lots of kids but their father was out of work, and the police would actually give the tickets for the ice to the individuals, and then those individuals would go to their local precinct house to pick up the ice handed out by Roosevelt's New York City police. Roosevelt then actually went out to see into the tenement district to see how families were using the ice. And so this is Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt, born a New York Knickerbocker, born in Gramercy Park into a beautiful brownstone with indoor plumbing, Harvard educated, fluent in French, fluent in German. Really, there was before Theodore Roosevelt was born, there was already a Roosevelt Street, a Roosevelt Hospital. This is one of the most prominent families of New York City. He got his start in New York City politics, going to the local Republican district home office, and he'd often go there on the way to the opera, and so he'd be dressed in his top hat and tails with his white gloves, visiting the Republican headquarters on the way to his private box in the opera. And here's Roosevelt, one of the wealthiest presidents we've ever had, going around the back alleys in New York's tenement district, seeing how fathers are chipping pieces of ice and giving them to their children to suck on. He saw mothers putting ice into handkerchiefs and rolling up the handkerchief and putting it on their children's heads to try to lower their body temperature. And so you think about American presidents, I'm not sure how many American presidents have had that kind of intimate contact with America's urban poor. One of the only ones I've been able to think of is Barack Obama, when he was a community organizer in my hometown originally of Chicago. And Roosevelt, so this is 1896 when this heat wave takes place. Roosevelt doesn't write his autobiography until after he loses that other race for the presidency in 1912. So he publishes his autobiography in 1913. So a quarter of a century later almost. And he remembers, and so he would write about these things in his autobiography. And at the time, he wrote to his sister, "I had to be in town several nights, and I saw some strange and pathetic scenes when the ice was being distributed." This is Roosevelt and the tenement children. This would have an effect on Roosevelt's life and career. Right afterwards, So his trajectory at this time is he resigns after being police commissioner for 2 years to become assistant secretary of the Navy under McKinley, and he serves that for 1 year before the Spanish-American War breaks out. Right? Then he goes as a 40-year-old, a lieutenant colonel at the head of a cavalry regiment, the Rough Riders, to Cuba, makes a name for himself in a war that only lasts about 4 months, becomes a household name. His account of the Rough Riders is serialized back in mainland United States, making him, like I said, a well-known figure across the country. And so basically the minute he sets foot back on New York soil after the end of the Spanish-American War, Republicans are asking him to run for governor. So this, think about this rapid trajectory. In 1896, he's not police chief. He's really one of 4 police commissioners. So that's 1896. By 1898, he's elected governor of the biggest state in the country, often seen, and often at this time, a stepping stone to the presidency. And then, of course, he becomes McKinley's vice president. After the 1900 election, McKinley's assassinated, he becomes president. But as governor, right, he took steps to try to alleviate the plight of the urban poor living in tenements. And we remember Theodore Roosevelt, of course, as a progressive president. He's really perhaps the first president to say that, yes, the government does have some responsibility for individual citizens, for their welfare. 1896, when the heat wave is taking place, it's right in the middle of what was called the Great Depression of the late 19th century. And 1896 is still, this is what kind of the 1896 presidential election is about. The fact that there is absolutely no relief for people suffering during this depression of the 1890s, and at all levels of government, from the mayor, governor, president of the United States. Yeah, that's too bad, but it should be left to private interests. It should be left to private charities to provide relief for individuals, right? Theodore Roosevelt is one of the first presidents to turn that on its head and to legislate for the safety, for the welfare of individual Americans. And you can see this, I think, the origins of this from partly the time when he's police commissioner during the heat wave, and then as governor, when he has control over the strings of the New York State legislature to try to bring some relief, especially in the construction of the tenements. The tenements themselves, the buildings themselves, were accomplices in the death of hundreds of victims during the heat waves. They were terribly constructed. There had been lots of efforts to try to make them more, friendly to the people who lived there. So, for instance, and this sounds like a good idea, having a central shaft instead of just having room after room after room, which includes interior rooms that don't have windows, that just have doors onto other rooms, rooms built never to see the light of day. Okay, well, now you have to have an interior ventilation shaft. So all rooms have to at least face either on the outside or the interior shaft. Well, what happens if you live on the 6th floor of a tenement and you have to take out the garbage and you don't feel like it? You throw it into the shaft, and everybody throws it into the shaft. And these long tubes become conduits for sound, become conduits for smells, and it gets so bad in summers that some residents actually end up nailing the windows shut to make sure the terrible miasma doesn't come into their tenements. Rear tenements, basement tenements that were so poorly built that they would regularly flood during when the river was high, during high tide, and you'd actually be living in a basement tenement, and the furniture would be like floating around your legs. And so this is, Roosevelt really being a champion as a chief executive of New York State of tenement reform, right? Trying to change building codes of dangerous practices. Buildings would frequently simply collapse in the late 19th century at New York. Opening of a tenement house exhibition, which tried to pinpoint where the worst tenements were and make a correlation between that and disease down in the tenements, right? Continuing recurrences of typhus and diphtheria and cholera among the poorest population in New York. Urges the state assembly to pass a tenement house bill, appoints to the commission reformers as well as health and safety experts. Often these commissions, like the Mosaic Committee, who would be on them? Building and real estate interests, right? The exact people you don't want making a decision about having laws that are going to pertain to building. And it results in a tenement house law, a landmark building law that Governor Theodore Roosevelt was the champion of. So this resulted in my first book on Theodore Roosevelt called Hot Time in the Old Town. And I like to think it has some relevance today. The World Meteorological Organization estimates that the number of heat-related fatalities is going to double in the next 20 years. And as people died in 2003, 1995, my hometown of Chicago, something like 900 people died. There wasn't enough room in the morgue, so there were actually like refrigeration trucks released to store all of the corpses. People are still dying for the same reasons that they did in 1896. Heat sources in the city, pollution in the air that traps the heat, and the very architecture of cities, right, that tend to reflect and absorb heat into them. Employers not taking precautions for their workers who literally work themselves to death. No access to air conditioning or cool water, and nothing done to save the most vulnerable, the very young and the very old. The 1896 New York heat wave then, I believe, although occurring over 100 years ago, can still give us clues as to how cities can respond to heat waves and save lives and make sure that these forgotten natural disasters don't occur. So thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thanks. So the question is, what is the status of water? And when Roosevelt was in the New York State legislature, one of the first things that concerned themselves was the water supply and the building of the Croton Aqueduct, which really was kind of one of the first times in the late 19th century that New York City did have a steady supply of clean water for two big concerns. One for disease. This is one of the reasons that New York City had recurring cholera epidemics throughout the 19th century, but also for putting out fires, right? Not having enough water is a bad thing. During summers, though, frequently the water pressure would be so low that in some of these tenements, if you had, for instance, a common sink on the second floor that everybody had to use, the water pressure would not be high enough to get even to the second floor of a tenement. And so the question is, does 1896 really kind of mark a change in public and government response to natural disasters? And I would say actually no. And I actually say that in my book, that it takes years, really. Right now in New York City, over the past year, they have something that's called the Heat Wave Project that's being done with their local NPR station. And I was interviewed about that because they're talking about the limits of having cooling centers for people. Often the elderly don't want to leave. What if your animals, your pets, aren't allowed into the cooling center? Are you going to leave your animal behind? Do people have a right not to die from heat waves? And does that mean, well, giving away small $200, $300, window installed air conditioners. I mean, the fact that we're still having this discussion about the effects of heat and how people respond to the heat in 2018, I think shows that no, FEMA's for the most part is not showing up when heat waves take place. And so the point I make that yes, this was done ad hoc by certain individuals taking the initiative, but did it leave in place a legacy of government responding to natural disasters? Absolutely not.
Okay, can I have just a follow up on that, please, if you'll indulge me?
Yeah, please.
Because you said that it brings out the issue of what is happening today, and I would put it to you that means of getting better and public policy has come to a halt in the last few decades. And I'll just give you some examples of indulge me, please. That in the 1960s, when the air was, we called it smog then, it was really bad, it resulted in the Clean Air Act of 1970, which was passed by a Democratic Congress and signed into law by Republican President Richard Nixon. 2 years later, when various rivers were on fire, most famously the Cuyahoga, that resulted in the Clean Water Act, which was even more remarkably passed over Nixon's veto. And 8 years after that, when Love Canal happened, it resulted in a remarkable piece of legislation called the Superfund Act. Okay, that was 40 years ago.
Right.
Now we get things like the oil spill in the Gulf and Hurricane Katrina, and the responses are embarrassingly lame for a country like ours. So it's been 40 years since we've got any major changes in public.
And I would add to that, one of the points obviously that I just made over the past few minutes was about who's the most vulnerable during these natural disasters, right? Who was the most vulnerable during Katrina was people who didn't have the means to evacuate, who didn't have a car, who didn't have any place to go. And that's this kind of old joke about, a trailer park during a tornado, right? Why does it seem like they're magnets for tornadoes? But of course, that is going to be a trailer and a trailer park that's going to have the most disastrous effect of a tornado. So I mean, I would absolutely agree with you and add that the very lack of government response or government planning is always going to affect during natural disasters, whether you're talking about tornado or hurricane or heat wave, the most vulnerable populations in the country. I mean, so the question is about Roosevelt and the progressive era. I would actually say that he's one of the fundamental drivers of the progressive era and the first progressive president. That ain't McKinley, that ain't Grover Cleveland, absolutely. Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson.
Part of a wave that had started prairie radicalism further west.
But again, I would point out that that's kind of William Jennings Bryan brand of populism and the social gospel. One of my points about putting Roosevelt, especially in the New York City context, is that he was in particular an urban progressive, and that's a different kind of animal. And so this is what his milieu was. How do you make American cities, which are of course exploding at this time because of immigration, because of urbanization, because of industrialization, how do you make these places safer, healthier places to live? So he's not as much concerned with the agrarian radicalism, the populism of somebody like William Jennings Bryan. And that's part of what I've always liked about Roosevelt, right? That people ask, well, why do you study him? And I'd say for several reasons. I think he changed the way Americans do domestic policy, the progressive legislation, things like the Pure Food and Drug Act. He changed American foreign policy, right? Seizing the Panama Canal Zone, but also hosting the Portsmouth Conference that brought an end to the Russo-Japanese War. He was a warrior and imperialist who won the Nobel Peace Prize, and he also changed the position of the presidency as well, right? So much of what is familiar to us as a modern presidency, like looking to the president for a budget, why do we do that? That's what Congress does. Looking to the president for a legislative agenda. Why do we do that? That's what Congress does. That's one of the reasons that arguably the Civil War happened. American presidents were passive. Theodore Roosevelt, passive is the last word you would ever use about him, right? He was a very active, arguably even activist president, and he and his family were stars in a way of a modern American president. So domestic policy, progressive era, foreign policy, and the presidency. Absolutely a trailblazing American president. Yes, sir.
Great talk.
Thank you.
I taught U.S. history, and I swear to you, I never heard of this.
Yes, me neither. I mean, I have a PhD in American history. I taught American history, and it seemed like a cool thing to do. At first, I thought it was just going to be a footnote about Theodore Roosevelt as police commissioner, but the more I looked into it, I thought it deserved a story of its own. And so this book is, it's a kind of a melange of different things. So it's a narrative history of the heat wave, and you get a kind of an intimate look at some of the victims, but it's also about Theodore Roosevelt, his life, his rise to this position, the influence of these events on him and his trajectory, including as a progressive president, and also you get a lot of William Jennings Bryan. So you get a lot of American presidential politics in 1896. And so the title's mine, but the subtitle was a bit of the publisher, right? The Great Heat Wave of 1896 and the Making of Theodore Roosevelt. Well, you know, it's a bit misleading. Some of the book reviews pointed out that it's a bit misleading. So if you're not that interested in William Jennings Bryan and populism and kind of this great divide between the Republicans and Democrats at this time, this might not be the book for you.
You know, it's interesting, too. I went to the Tenement Museum, and I look at what people did not have and what we take for granted today. And I give credit also to entrepreneurs who created the plumbing, the air conditioning, a lot of the things that we take for granted that started out as luxuries for the rich. I don't even know how I used to actually get up and change a channel without a remote control. But I look at a lot of what we take for granted and actually started out as luxuries for the rich and now are necessities that we take for granted. And I think they play a part that they're not really given credit for.
No, I do think this is actually something that arguably makes heat waves even more dangerous, because these things lull us into a false sense of security. I don't know how many times living in New York City in the middle of a heat wave and you see people out jogging like at noon. Why? Because I can always go back into an air-conditioned room and drink a cold drink of water. And of course, you know, electrical grids fail, right? Bodies can overheat, you know, like that. It takes minutes for a body to overheat, but it can take hours for a body to get back to its normal body temperature. Now, so that's the Western industrialized world, where we still have hundreds of people can die during heat waves. This happened in Western Europe in 2003, right? You know, thousands, tens of thousands of people died in August. Places like France with some of the greatest social safety nets in the world. Why'd they die in August? Because in France, nobody works in the government in August, right? Everybody's on vacation. So think about that and what I mentioned about Pakistan. Think about the developing world. I come from a developing country, Ankara, in Turkey. I lived for 14 years. That's going through urbanization and industrialization. And while my 14 years in Ankara, it grew from a city of 3 million to a city of 4 million, right? Istanbul, 12 million people. Everybody does not have electric air conditioning. Everybody does not have electric refrigeration, and they're still doing industrial work and manual work, right? They're not all working as bankers or lawyers or working in an air-conditioned Walmart or Target. So this is something, you know, keep your eye on the newspapers. As I do, you will see the next great disaster because of a heat wave. And, you know, I think about, you know, high school football teams starting their practices and their scrimmages in the middle of August, and oh, you have to stop for water, or because you're tired, oh, then you're not a tough guy, right? So I mean, we still, in many ways, don't take this stuff seriously. No, so the question was, the comment was just confirming that, and when you think about the mega cities that are developing in the developing world now, in Latin America, in the subcontinent, in Asia, Shanghai, yes, is a beautiful, glittering city that somehow rose overnight, but not everybody in Shanghai is buying a Ferrari, right, at the local dealership. There's millions of laborers who have been drawn to Shanghai for the construction jobs, for the labor jobs. And the fact is that not all the time, heat-related deaths are recorded as heat-related deaths, right? Maybe you have a pre-existing condition. Maybe you die of a heart attack, and that's what it gets listed as. And so this is what happened during this heat wave as well. You would have often, children dying of chronic diarrhea that would be listed as cholera infantum, right? Just this common disease that hit the children of the tenements every single summer. Well, this is something that is absolutely exacerbated by extreme heat, and you had tiny little babies dying from heat exhaustion, dying from dehydration. I remember the first time I was doing research for this book, and I left my family for a couple of weeks, went from Turkey to New York City, and my daughter had just been born. And so this book was published in 2010. My daughter was born in 2006. And I remember sitting at the microfilm reader at the municipal archives looking at, death certificate after death certificate, and I came across a batch that had been submitted by the doctor at the New York Foundling Home, right? So this was the home where you're an unwed mother, or you're too impoverished to take care of a baby, you drop your baby off at the foundling home. It's not called an orphanage, it's called a foundling home. And the heat wave was, just went through the foundling home like a hot knife through butter. So here I was away from my, baby daughter for the first time, and I'm reading these death certificates, baby John, 2 months old, baby Sarah, 5 months old, right? This is who dies now during heat waves, and we're not necessarily going to hear, yes, Karachi, 95 deaths. Oh, I bet you it was more than 95, and we might not know the full extent of the next heat wave. It's May, right? It's already getting pretty hot in the northern hemisphere. Climate change, anyone? Are we having, more extreme climate events or fewer extreme climate events? The next huge heat wave disaster is coming to a theater near you. Sorry to say. Yes, sir.
I take it from your subtitle that Roosevelt knew how to best take advantage of this opportunity and turn it into his political advantage. I mean, I'm wondering, the ice that he was distributing to Tenement, those were like Tammany Hall voters, not necessarily to people he would be coming on.
Yeah, but the problem is that by the time Roosevelt is doing this as police commissioner, the big, great initiative that he's remembered for in trying to tackle police corruption, because by the time Roosevelt becomes police commissioner, the Lexow Commission has already come out with its report and basically said that the entire police force should be fired because it constitutes the greatest kind of organized criminal gang in the city. This is what Roosevelt inherits as police commissioner. And Roosevelt realized that kind of one of the chinks in the armor in the system was a law that was being flouted regularly, and that was a blue law, right? The Sunday excise law, the Sunday saloon closing law. You had to close your saloons on a Sunday, but nobody did. And you could give money to your local policeman and he would allow you to stay open, or police would close, leave open the saloon of a local Tammany politician, because saloons often doubled as political headquarters for the local Tammany politician and close the saloon of his competitor. And so Roosevelt basically went on a crusade to close saloons on Sundays, and in so doing, he was very successful. Within a couple of weeks, he had closed about 97% of the saloons. The problem is that if you're a worker and an immigrant worker, as part of your culture, like being Irish or like being German, and Germans voted Republican in 1896 en masse in New York City, you are not happy with Police Commissioner Roosevelt. In the 1895 and 96 elections, the Republicans went down in massive defeat in the city elections. And who did local Republicans blame? They blamed Theodore Roosevelt. But, so it's kind of sad. Roosevelt, the police commissioner, this is the last position he's ever going to hold in the city. He's really kind of destroyed his chance for a city career. But when he's kind of, talking about this with his best friend, Henry Cabot Lodge, who's a Republican senator from Massachusetts, Lodge is saying, but wait, you're missing the bigger picture, right? What you're doing in the city is getting you a great reputation beyond the city. In upstate New York, which is more conservative, which it does have a temperance, level, string going through it. And so your career narrowly in New York City might be over, but it's opening greater possibilities for a statewide post, possibly sitting here in the Senate next to me. And Lodge, who's like 9 years Roosevelt senior, and kind of a political mentor, kind of a big brother to Roosevelt. Of course, Lodge is absolutely right. 2 years after this, his career in the city is absolutely gone, but he gets elected to governor of New York and a stepping stone to the presidency. So the question was about our family's decision to leave Turkey last July after 14 years, and did the political situation have something to do with it? And the answer is absolutely yes. It was kind of a personal decision. My wife is Turkish, and so my kids are half and half, and they've been born and raised in Turkey. We wanted them to have a chance to live in the United States. There was a professional decision. I kind of had reached kind of a ceiling in my career as an American at the private English language university where I was living, and so I was looking for, more professional development, and there was the political. The country that we left in 2017 was not the country where I arrived in 2003, right? In 2003, it was Western looking, secular, was very proud of equal rights for women. Ataturk made sure that equal rights for women and women getting the vote were in its 1923 constitution, right? For a Muslim country. This was amazing. And when going there, seeing how women were absolutely integrated into university life, into politics, it was a great place for a long time. And then Erdogan and the AKP came to power very soon after, and it was just kind of slow descent into autocracy, slow chipping away at civil rights, human rights, freedom of the press, freedom for women. And then kind of the final blow for me and my family was the coup attempt that took place on July 15th, 2016, after which there has been, still today, a state of emergency, right? Parliament really doesn't vote on legislation anymore. It's all done by fiat from the president of Turkey. Hundreds of thousands of people have been purged from the civil service. Universities have been closed. Tens of thousands of educators have lost their job. And it's not that there's a single, kind of moment that took place, but it's the uncertainty. I think what's next year going to bring? What's 3 years going to bring? What's 5 years going to bring? And trying to explain to my daughter, who I referenced before, gee, Daddy, why is the president of Turkey on TV saying that feminists have it wrong? There's no such thing as civil rights, and I'm going to prove this by reading the Quran. It's time to go. question is, as an American, was there a difference in how Turks treated me from 2003 to 2017? And while I would say it in two ways. On the one hand, it was, for 14 years, a great place to live. My wife and I thought we would retire there. We were making plans to do that. It was a great quality of life. Loved the people, loved the culture, loved the food, loved the music. Lots of reasons to stay, and people treated me very, very well, especially as an individual and at a university. I mean, professors in Turkey and lots of other places in the world, they're kind of revered, right? You tell people you're a professor, it's hocam, this great kind of title that you have, the special title of respect that you have. It was very kind of nice to have perhaps a level of respect for education that we don't get necessarily in the United States all the time. Oh, you're a history professor? Why? Why would you choose that path, right? Those who can't teach. Those who can't teach at Norwich University, apparently. So it was a very nice quality of life, but, and the big but there is that, yes, I saw anti-Americanism was on the rise. Who was blamed for the coup attempt in 2016, right? Gulen, who's in Pennsylvania, who's being protected by the United States, and the foreign minister in Turkey said, if you don't turn Gulen over, this will be considered an act of war by the United States against Turkey. Americans have been caught up and imprisoned without habeas corpus in Turkey. So it was a chilling, this chilling kind of evolution, absolutely, about being a foreigner in Turkey.
And does it seem to progressively be getting worse?
I think it's progressively getting worse, yeah. And my wife, again, who's Turkish and who loves her country, is very, very sad to see that. It was her as much as anybody else who wanted to come to the United States. And my students in Turkey, the history program was a graduate program, so I had master's students, PhD students, some of the brightest. And coincidentally, one of my PhD students this year is doing a Fulbright at Harvard. So this is the quality of students. Tomorrow he's going to rent a car, he's going to drive up to Norwich and see me and spend the day with me and then drive back down. Incredibly bright, ambitious people. And at one of my going away parties, all of my students were sitting around the table, all of my colleagues, and I looked around the table and I turned to my colleague and I said, not one of these Turkish students wants to stay and live and work in Turkey, right? They all are seeking ways to work and have careers and live abroad, and that's a shame. So think about the brain drain that's going to create for this developing country. The doctors, the lawyers, the educators, they're going to seek somewhere else to live.